How does a land so rich in history become a symbol of such profound and enduring conflict? This is the question that lies at the heart of Sudan. It is a vast country, a crossroads of Africa and the Arab world, where deserts meet savannas and ancient rivers carve paths through the sand. For millennia, this was a place of powerful empires and great cultural achievements. Yet in our modern world, its name is so often linked with stories of war, famine, and displacement. To understand the Sudan of today, with its complex political landscape and its deep, painful divisions, we must look back. We must journey through its long and often turbulent past to see how the lines on its map were drawn not just with ink but with power and, tragically, with blood. The story of Sudan is not a simple one. It cannot be told in headlines or brief news reports. It is a saga woven from countless threads: the rise and fall of pharaohs, the spread of powerful faiths, the ambitions of distant empires, and the resilient spirit of its diverse peoples. The very borders that define the nation today are a relatively recent creation, imposed by foreign powers with little regard for the intricate tapestry of cultures and communities that had existed for centuries. These artificial lines cut through ethnic groups, separated communities with shared histories, and forced together peoples with long-standing rivalries. The consequences of these decisions have echoed through generations, fueling a cycle of conflict that continues to shape the nation's destiny. To truly grasp the present, we must begin in the distant past, long before the arrival of colonial administrators or the drawing of modern frontiers. We must travel back to a time when this land was known as Nubia, a cradle of civilization that rivaled even ancient Egypt in its power and sophistication. Here, along the fertile banks of the River Nile, great kingdoms rose, leaving behind monuments that still stand as silent witnesses to a forgotten glory. The pyramids of Meroe, the temples of Kerma, the stories of the Black Pharaohs who ruled over Egypt itself, all speak of a heritage that is both profound and uniquely African. This ancient greatness provides a stark and poignant contrast to the struggles of the modern era. The journey through Sudan's history is therefore a journey of contrasts. It is a story of magnificent achievements and devastating setbacks, of unity and division, of hope and despair. We will explore how this land of ancient wonders became entangled in the great power struggles of the 19th century. We will see how its fate was decided in distant European capitals, and how the legacy of that era continues to haunt its people. From the Mahdist revolt against foreign rule to the long and brutal civil wars of the 20th century, and from the birth of the world's newest nation, South Sudan, to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Darfur, the narrative is one of a relentless struggle for identity, for resources, and for peace. Long before the current borders existed, this region was home to one of Africa's most remarkable civilizations, the Kingdom of Kush. Flourishing for over 1,000 years, its influence stretched deep along the Nile Valley. The Kushites were not merely neighbors of the Egyptian pharaohs. They were at times their rivals, their trading partners, and even their conquerors. During the 25th dynasty, a line of Kushite kings, often called the Black Pharaohs, ruled over all of Egypt, uniting the Nile Valley under their command. They embraced Egyptian culture, building and restoring temples, while also preserving their own distinct Nubian identity. Their story is a powerful reminder that this land was once a center of immense power and cultural innovation, a beacon of civilization in the ancient world. The heart of this kingdom eventually moved south to the city of Meroe. Here, nestled between the Nile and Atbara rivers, the Kushite civilization developed a unique character. They created their own script, a form of writing that scholars are still working to fully decipher. They became masters of ironwork, a technology that gave them both economic and military strength. The most iconic legacy of this period is the stunning collection of steep-sided pyramids at Meroe. Though smaller than their Egyptian counterparts, these structures are no less impressive, serving as the final resting places for Kushite royalty. Standing in clusters in the desert sand, they are a powerful, silent testament to a sophisticated and wealthy society that thrived for centuries. The wealth of Kush was built on trade, its strategic location on the Nile, and its command over resources like gold, ivory, ebony, and iron made it a vital hub in ancient trading networks. Caravans crossed the vast Sahara, connecting Nero with the Mediterranean world, the Red Sea, and the African interior. This exchange was not just of goods, but also of ideas, cultures, and technologies. The art and architecture of Meroe show a fascinating blend of Egyptian, Greco-Roman, and sub-Saharan African influences, creating a style that was uniquely its own. It was a cosmopolitan center, a place where different worlds met, demonstrating the region's long history as a continental crossroads. However, like all great empires, the Kingdom of Kush eventually declined. The reasons are complex, likely involving a combination of factors including environmental change, the shifting of trade routes, and the rise of the rival kingdom of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia. By the 4th century AD, Meroe had been abandoned, and the great Kushite kingdom fragmented into smaller successor states. The sands of the desert slowly began to reclaim the magnificent cities and temples. But the legacy of Kush did not disappear entirely. It lived on in the culture and the people, a foundational layer of history upon which new kingdoms, new faiths, and new struggles would later be built. The arrival of Islam in the 7th century marked a profound and lasting transformation for the region. Carried by Arab traders and migrating tribes, the faith gradually spread southwards along the Nile and across the trade routes of the Sahara. This was not a sudden conquest, but a slow process of cultural and religious fusion that took place over many centuries. New Islamic sultanates, such as the Funj Sultanate of Sana'a and the Sultanate of Darfur, emerged and grew powerful. These states controlled the lucrative trans-Saharan trade, which saw gold, ivory, and enslaved people move north in exchange for textiles, salt, and other goods from the Mediterranean world. This trade brought great wealth and connected the region more closely than ever to the wider Islamic world. For centuries, these sultanates governed the lands of Sudan, creating complex societies with their own systems of law, administration, and culture. The city of Sana'a became a celebrated center of Islamic scholarship and trade, attracting scholars from across the Muslim world. However, the 19th century brought a dramatic and violent disruption to this established order. In 1821, the ambitious ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, acting as a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, invaded and conquered the Funj Sultanate. This Turco-Egyptian rule was established to exploit Sudan's resources, primarily gold, ivory, and slaves, to fund Muhammad Ali's own military and industrial ambitions. The new regime was foreign, exploitative, and deeply resented by the local population. This resentment festered for decades, fueled by heavy taxation, brutal administration, and religious fervor. In 1881, a charismatic Islamic cleric named Muhammad Ahmad proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the guided one who, according to prophecy, would appear at the end of time to restore justice and true Islam. He called for a holy war, or jihad, to expel the foreign occupiers and purify the faith. His call resonated powerfully across Sudan, uniting diverse tribes and peoples under a single banner of religious and national liberation. The Mahdist movement grew with astonishing speed, overwhelming Egyptian garrisons across the country with its fierce, dedicated warriors. The culmination of this uprising was the siege and capture of Khartoum in January 1885. The city was defended by an Anglo-Egyptian force led by the British General Charles Gordon, who had been sent to oversee the evacuation of Egyptian personnel. Despite his efforts, the Mahdist forces broke through the city's defenses, overrunning the garrison and killing Gordon in the process. The fall of Khartoum was a stunning victory for the Mahdi and a profound humiliation for the British Empire, which had become deeply involved in Egypt's affairs. The Mahdi established a new, independent state with its capital at Omdurman, across the Nile from Khartoum. For a brief period, Sudan was once again ruled by its own people under a revolutionary Islamic government. The independent Mahdist state, however, was to be short-lived. The British, stung by the defeat at Khartoum, and driven by the wider imperial ambitions of the so-called Scramble for Africa, were determined to reconquer Sudan. They saw the Mahdi state as a threat to their control over Egypt and the Suez Canal, which was a vital waterway to India. More broadly, they wanted to secure the headwaters of the Nile and prevent rival European powers, particularly France, from gaining a foothold in the region. The reconquest was meticulously planned and, honestly, brutally executed. An Anglo-Egyptian army, equipped with modern artillery and Maxim machine guns, advanced south under the command of General Herbert Kitchener. The decisive confrontation came in 1898 at the Battle of Omdurman. The Mahdist army, though vastly outnumbering Kitchener's force, was armed primarily with swords and spears. They charged with immense bravery, but were systematically annihilated by the superior firepower of the British-led troops. The battle was a massacre, resulting in tens of thousands of Mahdist casualties for the loss of fewer than 50 of Kitchener's soldiers. This catastrophic defeat shattered the Mahdist state and ushered in a new era of foreign domination. Sudan was placed under a unique and complex system of joint rule known as the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. In reality, Britain held all the power, with Egypt serving as a junior partner. It was during this period of colonial rule that the modern borders of Sudan were formally drawn. These lines were not based on the ethnic, linguistic, or religious realities on the ground. Instead, they were products of European geopolitical convenience, negotiated in distant capitals like London, Paris, and Brussels. The borders were drawn to define spheres of influence, to separate British territory from that of the French to the west and the Belgians to the south. In the process, they sliced through the territories of ethnic groups like the Zaghawa in Darfur and the Azande in the south, stranding communities on opposite sides of a new international frontier. At the same time, the vast territory enclosed within these new borders contained a staggering diversity of peoples with very different histories and cultures. The British administrators governed the predominantly Muslim, Arabic-speaking north very differently from the largely animist and Christian ethnically African south. They implemented a southern policy which aimed to halt the spread of Islam and Arab influence southwards, effectively isolating the two regions from one another. Southern provinces were administered separately, English was promoted over Arabic, and Christian missionaries were encouraged. This policy of divide and rule deliberately deepened the existing cultural and religious fault lines. It created two Sudans within one country, laying the groundwork for the deep-seated mistrust and conflict that would erupt with devastating consequences after independence. As the tide of colonialism began to recede across the globe after the Second World War, the question of Sudan's future became urgent. The path to independence was complex, shaped by political maneuvering in London, Cairo, and Khartoum. Egypt, having overthrown its own monarchy in 1952, pushed for unity with Sudan, envisioning a single, powerful Nile Valley state. The British, however, favoured an independent Sudan, hoping to maintain their influence in the region. Within Sudan itself, political parties emerged, largely dominated by the northern Arab elite. The voices and aspirations of the southern peoples, who feared domination by the north, were largely ignored in these high-level negotiations. On January 1, 1956, Sudan proudly raised its flag as an independent nation. It was a moment of great hope and celebration, but the foundations of the new state were, honestly, dangerously fragile. The colonial legacy of divide and rule had left a deep chasm between the north and the south. The northern-dominated government in Khartoum immediately moved to consolidate its power, pursuing policies of Arabization and Islamization. Arabic was declared the official language, and Islam was promoted as the state religion, alienating the non-Arab, non-Muslim populations of the south, as well as other marginalized groups in the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile regions. The promises of a federal system that would grant autonomy to the south were quickly abandoned. The southern peoples, who had been promised a say in their own future, felt betrayed. They had exchanged one set of colonial masters for another. Tensions that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. As early as 1955, just months before independence, a mutiny by southern soldiers in the town of Torit had already signaled the coming storm. This event is widely seen as the start of the First Sudanese Civil War. It was a desperate and violent reaction to the perceived political, economic, and cultural marginalization by the new government in Khartoum. The southern resistance, initially fragmented, gradually coalesced into a guerrilla movement known as the Anya Nia. The conflict that ensued was brutal and protracted. For 17 years, from 1955 to 1972, the country was ravaged by a war that pitted the government army against the southern rebels. The fighting was characterized by widespread human rights abuses, the displacement of entire communities, and a devastating loss of life. The war was not just about territory. It was a struggle for identity, for religious freedom, and for a fair share of political power and economic resources. This first civil war set a tragic precedent, entrenching the deep-seated animosity and mistrust between the North and the South, and ensuring that the story of independent Sudan would be defined by conflict rather than by unity. A period of relative peace followed the signing of the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972, which ended the First Civil War. The agreement granted the South a significant degree of autonomy, creating a southern Sudan autonomous region with its own executive and legislative bodies. For a decade, an uneasy calm settled over the country. However, the underlying issues of resource distribution, religious identity, and political power were never fully resolved. The discovery of significant oil reserves in the south during the 1970s dramatically raised the stakes. The central government in Khartoum became increasingly determined to control this newfound wealth, viewing it as essential for the national economy. This fragile peace was shattered in 1983. President Jafar Nimeri, facing economic crisis and political instability, made a series of decisions that reignited the conflict. He unilaterally redrew the boundaries of the southern region to place the newly discovered oil fields under northern control. Then, in a move that alienated the South completely, he abrogated the Addis Ababa Agreement and imposed a strict version of Islamic law, or Sharia, across the entire country, including the predominantly non-Muslim South. For Southerners, this was the final straw. A new rebellion erupted led by the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or SPLA, and its charismatic leader, Dr. John Garang. This marked the beginning of the Second Sudanese Civil War. This second war was even longer and more devastating than the first, lasting for 22 years. It became one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century, resulting in an estimated 2 million deaths, mostly from war-induced famine and disease, and the displacement of more than 4 million people. The SPLA, under Garang's leadership, did not initially seek outright secession. Instead, it fought for a new Sudan, a secular, democratic, and unified state where power and resources were shared equitably among all its diverse peoples. The government in Khartoum, particularly after Omar al-Bashir seized power in a military coup in 1989, framed the conflict as a holy war to defend Islam against infidels, further deepening the religious divide. After years of brutal stalemate and immense international pressure, a breakthrough was finally achieved. Exhaustive peace talks, mediated by regional and international partners, led to the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or CPA, in 2005. This landmark accord laid out a detailed power-sharing arrangement and, crucially, granted the South the right to a referendum on self-determination after a 6-year interim period. In January 2011, the people of southern Sudan voted in that referendum with near unanimity. An overwhelming 98.8% chose to secede. On July 9, 2011, the Republic of South Sudan was born, and the map of Sudan was redrawn once more, this time through the will of its people, but at the cost of millions of lives. Just as the world's attention was focused on the North-South conflict, another devastating crisis was brewing in Sudan's vast western region of Darfur. This conflict, which erupted in 2003, had different roots, but was born of the same toxic mix of political marginalization, economic neglect, and ethnic tension that had plagued the country for decades. Rebel groups, primarily from the non-Arab Fur, Zaghawa, and Masalit communities, took up arms against the government in Khartoum. They accused the government of oppressing Darfur's non-Arab population and favoring the region's Arab nomadic tribes in disputes over land and resources, which had been exacerbated by years of drought and desertification. The government's response was swift and merciless. It unleashed a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, relying not only on its regular army, but also on a proxy militia known as the Janjaweed. These devils on horseback, recruited from local Arab tribes, launched a scorched earth campaign across Darfur. They targeted civilians from the same ethnic groups as the rebels, systematically destroying villages, poisoning wells, and committing widespread atrocities including mass killings and sexual violence. The United States government and many human rights organizations labeled the campaign a genocide, an accusation the Sudanese government vehemently denied. The world watched in horror as a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions unfolded. The Darfur crisis prompted a massive international response. The United Nations and the African Union deployed a joint peacekeeping mission known as UNAMID to protect civilians, though its effectiveness was often limited by government restrictions and the sheer scale of the violence. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for several senior Sudanese officials, including President Omar al-Bashir, on charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. This made Bashir the first sitting head of state to be indicted by the ICC, further isolating his regime on the world stage. Despite these efforts, the violence continued for years, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and displacing millions into sprawling, squalid camps. Today, on June 15, 2025, Sudan finds itself at another critical juncture. The ousting of Omar al-Bashir in 2019, after months of popular protests, brought a brief flickering hope for a democratic transition. But that hope has been overshadowed by economic collapse, political infighting, and the outbreak of new, devastating conflicts, most notably the war that began in April 2023 between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the successor to the Janjaweed. Sudan's long and painful journey continues. It is a nation caught between its ancient heritage of greatness and the modern legacy of borders drawn in blood and power. The quest for lasting peace, stability, and a unified identity remains the country's greatest and most urgent challenge.